Welcome to episode 14 of Renewing the Conversation, a series of interviews where we talk to leading industry professionals and experts about renewable energy and heating, with a focus on the home and what challenges face the industry and homeowners.
Today we welcome Geoff Ellison, Director of Dragon Drilling. Geoff explains the process of drilling boreholes for water and ground source heat pump systems and how much it will cost and what equipment they use.
Before we get started, we want to say a huge thank you to today's sponsor, the MCS, which define, maintain and improve quality by certifying products and installers so homeowners can have confidence in the low carbon technology they invest in. To find out more, head over to www.mcscertified.com.
Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button below and show us your support by giving us a thumbs up. Enjoy the interview. Hi, good morning, Geoff. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us today and explain to us a little bit more about drilling. My understanding is that Dragon Drilling do drilling for ground source borehole and for water boreholes. Does it make sense that when a customer comes to you and they're looking at putting a ground source borehole in, that they automatically kind of consider, obviously, budget restrictions taking into account, but does it automatically make sense for them to also consider putting in a water borehole at the same time?
Yeah, there are times when you can use the same borehole for both purposes. That's called an open loop system. You take the water out of the ground, take the heat out of the water, and then put the water back into the environment. That's not a very common operation because it involves numerous permits from the Environment Agency. But in terms of the equipment's the same. So if somebody wants a borehole for water and also a system for ground source, they can be done at the same time. It would save a mobilisation charge as well.
You mentioned there things like permits and things. If someone is thinking about contacting a drilling company such as yourselves to consider putting in a borehole for water or for ground source, what are the things that should be top of mind before they even contact you? What are the things that they should be considering the most? Like maybe, for example, access or something. What are the things that they kind of need to have thought through?
Well, we'll think that sort of issue through for them. Obviously, access for a rig depends on the size of the rig we're going to use. But the first thing they've got to consider is what do we actually want? If it's a heating system, that's fine. If it's a closed loop system, there are no permits required for that. If it's an open loop system, then you are limited at taking 20 cubes of water, 20,000 litres a day out there. Any more than that, and you need a permit. So if you're a big water user, dairy farm or something like that, then you need to probably have a permit to extract the water. But for an ordinary domestic dwelling, 20,000 litres of water is way more than you're going to need. So to all intents and purposes, for a water borehole and for a ground source borehole, closed loop system, no permits required.
And what are the depths that you're typically drilling to for those two things, for the water and the ground source?
Water tends to be more shallow. We're probably going down 60 to 100 metres for a ground source system. We'll be going down anything to 150 to 200 metres usually.
So now let's say for argument's sake that you go onto a site and you start drilling for a ground source system. What happens when you hit water? Is it, because we've never seen that before. Yeah. So when you actually hit that water, is it as dramatic as perhaps the water jetting out of the hole or something like that?
Yeah. Well, it can be. In a spectacular situation, if you were drilling with something like an air flush, then you could get copious amounts of water coming to the surface. Likewise, if the water table was artesian, you may get groundwater pressure coming out and you've released that pressure, that may come out as well. So we do research before we start to try and ascertain the groundwater level we anticipate going to hit. And if we do find water coming to the surface, we have to manage that. We have to take out the solids and find somewhere to discharge it back into the environment.
So you mentioned that you've got different extraction sizes for the actual vehicles and the rigs themselves. What is kind of the smallest rig that you've got to perhaps assist somebody that wants to put a ground source maybe in a suburban type property or on a smaller residential type property, maybe on a driveway or something like that? What is the smallest vehicle size or rig size that you can get into that?
Our smallest rig is about 9.5 tonnes in terms of its weight. In terms of access-wise, if you can get onto your driveway with a long wheelbase Land Rover, then that rig will be able to get on there. So it's quite small, it's quite compact. It can get into various nooks and crannies, and for one character, we actually moved it using a Chinook helicopter. We have an island, and we moved that using a helicopter to gain access with it. So
wow, that must have been pretty spectacular.
and it's very nerve-wracking when you have one of your assets dangling beneath something like that, it is a bit nerve-wracking. But yeah, that job carried out, and that was a water borehole and a ground source heating system carried out on a remote island.
So yeah, that's really interesting. So for just for domestic, I know you mentioned dairy farms and more kind of commercial projects, but for domestic homeowners, can you just tell us about two different types of extreme projects that you have? So something that's really a very small, tight domestic space on a much smaller scale, and then something that's kind of like almost like a grand designed mega kind of domestic project, just so that people can kind of ascertain the various different uses in the domestic setting.
We've done systems for housing associations where we've done a row of terraced houses, and each house has its own borehole inside its front garden. So we've done the whole row, and each property has its own heat pump inside it. So that's totally independent. On the contrary, we've had situations where somebody's got a grand design style of house, multiple bedrooms, swimming pools, a whole load of stuff, and that's obviously a much larger operation requiring probably 7 or 8 boreholes to satisfy the demand for that particular property.
So still focusing on the residential side of things, is there a rule of thumb as to how many boreholes you will need to heat a property of a certain size?
This industry is fraught with issues with people working to rules of thumb. Never work to a rule of thumb. It will give you an idea. But if somebody came to me and said they wanted a specific amount of heat from a property, we would ask, first of all, where they got their information from. That needs to be a qualified and competent engineer who can say how many kilowatts you need for your central heating and also for your hot water. Once I know how many kilowatts you need, then one of my geologists will look at the underlying geology and ascertain how many meters of drilling we need to get that amount of heat out of the ground. Maybe one borehole, maybe multiple boreholes. You may find geological conditions are difficult, and it may be easier to put 3 boreholes, which are shallower, rather than one very deep one. So it's not a situation of rules of thumb. We like to work on true science, and one of our geologists will check that out to ensure that we don't fall short of that. On a large project, you may want to do a test hole first and do what's called a thermal response test to get the actual measurement of heat transfer from the ground. That's not cheap, but if you're doing a project which may have 30 or 40 boreholes and it saves you 2 boreholes, then it's been money well spent. So it's a horses for courses situation.
So you mentioned that, for example, with the terraced houses project, that's just 1 borehole per property. And then, for example, in a much bigger size property, you could have up to like 7 kind of boreholes. A silly question, but are all the boreholes the same size?
In theory, they would be easy to have them all the same size. In practice, there may be situations where you may hit an obstruction, you may have a borehole that starts to collapse. So there could be variable amounts in there. The important thing is to record what you've done. So if you've done 2 boreholes to 120 and 1 to 105, then pass that information to the designer so they can ensure that their design characteristics are still within the parameters of what you've been set. So important to record what you do and pass that information back to the guy who's designed the system.
And so when you walk through, for example, like a terraced house, and you walk through like their front garden where they've got a borehole, how big is it when you're actually standing there in the garden and you look down on the ground? How big does it look? Really?
Wow.
6 inches across.
Wow.
And the equipment that goes in there is made of polyethylene, so you don't need to go and revisit that at any time. So on completion, in my house, I've got 2 boreholes under a lawn and 1 under a veg patch. You don't need to go back to them, and you wouldn't know they were there.
So as the drilling company, you obviously drill the hole. Is it then also your responsibility to put the heat loops into the hole and then backfill that?
Yeah, we put the loops into the ground. We measure how far down we've gone. We will test those loops to ensure they don't leak and that they flow correctly. And we will also inject under pressure a grout for intimate contact between the loop and the surrounding ground to make sure we get good heat transfer characteristics. So on completion, I suppose all we've got is 2 small pipes sticking out of the ground. Doesn't seem a lot for the money involved, but the quality is in the depth and the quality of the ground that's been put in.
You've mentioned that you then put the grout back in, which I assume just helps with the actual thermal conductivity. what happens to all of the sand and the silt and everything else that you've extracted from the ground? What happens to that?
That's blown to the surface. Depending on what technique you're going to be using, we will intercept that so it doesn't spread all over the customer's property. We'll go to a skip. And depending on what they want us to do, if it's stone, bits of rock, they may want to use that for patching up driveways. If they don't want it, we'll take it away as an inert waste.
And then if you have multiple boreholes that you need to drill for the ground source, what kind of spacing are we talking about between each of the respective holes?
We normally work at 6 metre centres. Somebody has calculated that's a distribution network which stops them competing with each other in an unfavourable way. So that is a rule from 6 metre centres. If it's more, that's fine, but we work as a minimum of 6 metre centres.
You kind of touched on just very briefly there that the cost involved in doing, for example, ground source boreholes is quite an investment. I mean, there's a lot of discussion at the moment with regards to heat pumps and the potential of that investment coming down as the demand increases over the next 5 to 10 years. Do you also think that the costs will come down a little bit for installing ground source in the future?
Costs will come down. There's obviously going to be economy of scale. Heat pumps themselves, if you have multiple manufacturers in there, the cost of those will come down. In terms of the drilling side of it, we don't just drill boreholes in this industry for ground source. They're for water boreholes, they're for site investigations. And prices have been fairly consistent for a long period of time. The equipment we're using is highly specialised, it's expensive. We're talking about skilled operators. So I don't see any massive savings coming in from the drilling side.
So with regards to the costs, is there any kind of ballpark kind of figure that homeowners can kind of work with so that they can actually decide whether this is something that they should pursue for ground source, for example?
It's always very dangerous to quote things like that, but it's a question that I get asked on a regular basis. So a borehole is going to cost you somewhere between £5,000 and £8,000. But bear in mind, a borehole can be anything from 100 metres to 300 metres. So it's a bit of a piece of string situation. And there are times when it may be cheaper to say, if you needed 200 metres of drilling, then it may be cheaper to put 3 70-metre boreholes in than to put one 200-metre borehole. That's down to, again, the geological conditions and the equipment you need to deploy.
Right.
So it's a bit of it's a dangerous thing to say it's going to cost this amount. And I do try to work from empirical data and give accurate figures.
And that price is for the drilling. That's not a price that includes then, for example, the looped system for the actual ground source.
That's our bit. That's the grouted loop in place. So that's the finished product is 2 small pieces of pipe, 40 mil diameter, sticking out of what looks like a bit of clay slop.
So you mentioned the geologist earlier on. Is that something that's part of your standard service? Is that actually factored into the pricing? Because I would assume that you're going to face different challenges if, for example, you go to an area where there's a lot of loose stone versus solid granite. Is that something that's factored into the price?
That's an expert's question. That's absolutely spot on. Different areas of the country will have different geological conditions. If we go to London, we've probably got 80 metres of London clay before we hit chalk. If we're in North Wales and Anglesey, the rocks there are very, very old, highly fissured, highly fractured. And you may go through several different types of rock structure to get to the depth you require. So it's a horses for courses, and it's an essential requirement that one of my geologists will study from the British geological records, the underlying geology, to go to site and go there with the right equipment. There are times when the BGS records are not accurate, and when we submit our logs back to them, they can then amend their records because our information may be more up to date.
You mentioned the clay and chalk in London and the harder rocks up in North Wales. Do each of those different soil types or things that you actually hit have different levels of thermal conductivity?
Again, that's the job for the hydrogeologist to ascertain what the heat transfer efficiency is. And if you're going to be doing a large project, that's why you need to do that thermal response test. Instead of working off estimations, it's one of those situations, measure if you can, model it if you can't. If you're doing a big project, then you want to go in there, do 2, maybe 3 TRT tests in there, so you're working from empirical data, and then the design of the collection network will be in keeping with what the designer expects.
So Dragon drilling, do you work across the entire UK? Do you work across Scotland, England, Wales? And where do you see the majority of inquiries and customers are there any hot spots where you have the majority of your customers located?
We work the whole country. And obviously, our hotspot tends to be more local. So we do an awful lot of drilling in Wales. The drilling in Wales is quite complicated. So if we go to London and we go through 80 metres of clay and then hit chalk, that's easy. North Wales is a difficult place to do drilling. People come to North Wales to undertake geology field courses. They do that because the geology is interesting. If you're a driller, the geology is challenging in North Wales. So we work the whole country, but our home territory is Wales, the northwest of England, into Cheshire, the Midlands. That's our home base.
And is it a seasonal business? Do you do most of your drilling during the summer or during the dry months, or does it really not make too much of a difference if you're working into the winter?
It makes no difference at all. Obviously, day length is a factor. Our latest rigs have come fully equipped with floodlights, so we can work longer hours. But it's not a seasonal issue. It's obviously a seasonal issue for the guy who's operating the rig because it's unpleasant to be working in bad weather. But we do equip them with a full set of PPE, but we're aiming to work rigs not just during the hours of daylight. They've got floodlights now, so we can double shift our rigs to work 24 hours a day.
So that's actually quite a good question that I'd like to ask now. In terms of the length that it takes to drill a hole, and I appreciate that it's obviously going to vary on what you're drilling into. So can you tell us like a London type thing where it's largely a chalky and clay versus something that is a lot more hard in terms of hard rock that you hit? How long would it take to drill one hole for a ground source project?
Well, your rate of drilling depends on the rock you're going through and the tooling you've got. If you've got the right tooling, it shouldn't make a lot of difference. So if you're going through hard rock in North Wales, you'd be using a down the hole hammer. If you're working in the chalk, you'd be using a PDC bit. So it's a bit like playing golf. You're not playing with one club. You've got a different series of clubs in your bag. But in terms of how far we want to go in there, if we're going through granite, with a hammer, we'll drill through that at a rate of 10 meters an hour. If we're using a PDC bit going through clay and chalk, we'll drill that at 20 meters an hour.
Does it make a difference? So, for example, you mentioned we're talking about what you're drilling through, and whether it's really, really tough, granite, or the chalk, which is softer. Does it make a difference when you are drilling something through something that's a lot harder? The distance from the property. So, for example, when you were saying something like the hammer drilling and going through, I'm just imagining if you're drilling a meter outside your kitchen window, the whole house is kind of shaking and vibrating. Is that something else that you have to take into consideration?
It's horses for courses. If we're going to be using down the hole hammer, I'm not going to be working 24 hours a day because probably the people working for may tolerate it. If they have neighbours, then they will not. So we have to decide which sites we can work around the clock on and which sites we have to be more receptive to their views. So horses for courses. If it's a site middle of nowhere, homeowner wants to get on with the job quickly, then we can put the floodlights on, we can double shift the rig. So it's one of those situations you've got to be have a bit of sympathy for the people around you.
And the distance from the property, is that something that also needs to be considered?
Access-wise, we work very close to properties. We will normally stand away from a property by 6 to 10 metres. That's because we need to access around the rig for delivery of certain key components. They get the loops in there and things like excavators. So we need some room around the rig. But if it's very tight, then we can work in a very close proximity to the property. Of course, making sure you don't pebble dash the property with things coming out of the ground. So again, we have deflectors on there to make sure as we hit water, as we take out bits of gravel, they don't fly all over the place because we don't want to cause damage to the client's property.
If a homeowner is considering putting a ground source unit in, and obviously drilling is going to be required for that, are there any requirements from their side that they should provide you as the driller? So, for example, do they need to give you access to water to cool the drills, or is there any kind of lubrication? I mean, is there anything that they should be aware of that they would have to provide to you?
If they've got water there, that's sometimes an advantage because sometimes we do use water as a flushing media. If they don't have it and it's a site in the middle of nowhere, they will have to bring water in containers and use it that way. Again, that's down to the site visit when our engineer will talk there to the client to find out in addition to looking at access issues, whether they've got issues with neighbours who may be awkward, and whether or not there is water on tap that we can use. If they haven't, then we'll bring it.
And does the homeowner is there any onus on the homeowner to get any special permits or licenses or council permissions before they get you on site?
There are no permits, it's a general development order, so that's not something we have to deal with at the moment.
We interviewed Laura Bishop from the Ground Source Heat Pump Association recently, and she spoke, tried to make it quite clear to us that, you are drilling to depths of like 100, 150 meters, that these are not fracking depths.
Yeah.
She tried to make that very clear because I think perhaps there's a misconception amongst people. I don't know why, but there seems to be a bit of a misconception about the depth of drilling. Could you just speak to that point a little bit?
Yeah, well, one thing we put up when we're drilling on the site is to explain who we are with our telephone number, so if anybody has any issues, they can let us know. And what we're doing, it will say another borehole being drilled by Dragon Drilling. It will be a water borehole or a ground source borehole. There's a good thing in that, because very often people want to know what's going on, and they will actually, it'll be an inquiry. Someone drives past, thinks, yeah, I could do with one of those. So it's an advert, and it also confirms that we're not fracking. And we've had issues there where we've worked in areas where fracking's being done. And we've had to go and talk to demonstrators to point out that what we're doing is nothing like the depth that fracking is. It's a water borehole, for example, and they usually, if you approach them, they're usually fairly amenable when you can explain what you're trying to do.
What are the fracking depths, just so that people can really understand that there is a major difference?
You're going down fracking, you're going down hundreds of meters to get into the shell beds. So it's akin to drilling for oil or whatever. You're going down very deep, and you're also going down with a rig which arrives in component parts and is assembled. Our rigs are 10 site, they come off the back of a low loader and they start to operate. If you're doing fracking, then the rig is something that arrives in various components. You assemble it, and it's a totally different ballgame.
So you mentioned that the holes are backfilled with this special grout. What exactly is it made out of?
It's usually either a cement or a clay-based item. It will be selected and by the designer, because it's up to him to ascertain the rate of transfer on there. So we will be following instructions on that. In terms of what we can do, it's important we have a piece of equipment there which mixes the grout thoroughly and also injects it under the correct pressure. We inject the grout from the bottom to the top. So when I say we have 2 pipes into the ground, there's a third pipe. It's called a tramming pipe. So we fill from the bottom to the top, and then when the material starts exuding from the surface, we know that we've got a good mix there, a good contact between the loop and the grout for the entire depth of the bore.
Does that solidify over time and it almost becomes like a hard concrete type base?
Cementatious things will solidify more than the clay-based ones, but they sit there simply providing a good thermal transmission zone between the liquid inside the tube and the surrounding ground.
So is it a fair point to say that you as the driller don't really get too involved in the actual design of the system? You basically get given the instructions from the designers of that particular ground source system that's going to get put into place. You basically drill the holes, make sure that everything's ready to go, and then they come in and connect to that and set the whole system up?
Yeah, the designer is the person who sets the standard for what we've got to do, and then it's important that we work to the standard to make sure that what we've done is what the designer wished. If you found you had to go in there and do a certain number of boreholes, and for some reason you couldn't get to depth, then that's the time to tell the designer, we haven't done 3 boreholes, we recommend we do a 4th one. He'll say, well, the 4th one needs to be X meters deep, and that way he can then change his design parameters to ensure that what we've done will actually work.
So for a homeowner that is considering putting in, for example, a water borehole or a ground source, when they contact you, what is the kind of process that they should be looking at expecting? How many different site visits? Who are they going to be expecting to come out? And, kind of what kind of lead times are they going to be looking at?
Well, the first thing we do, because people usually say, what's it going to cost? And that's not an easy thing to really predict. So we will do a desk study. So somebody will come in and say, I need a water borehole or X number of kilowatts out of the ground. So one of my designers then will say, or my geologist will work out, if you like, a desk study of actually what's going to be required. On that basis, we can then knock out an itemised bit of quantities on that basis. And if that sounds attractive, then we will send out an engineer to do a full site audit, look for underlying issues, power cables, overhead cables, things like that, areas we need to avoid, things in the area which may be something we need to consider, sites of special scientific interest. That will be a full-blown survey. He will prepare a dossier, which will then go back to the drilling manager, who will then say, for working in this area, we're going to need to supply X, Y, Z equipment, so that when we turn up, we're fully tooled up, having undertaken a full investigation of what we are going to deal with regard to access. And it's not just access on the site itself. It may be access to the site. We may have to undertake and negotiate narrow lanes with a large piece of equipment. We may have to take off the occasional branch of a tree, but that's all part of it. So when we arrive on site, the driller should have everything he needs there, so we can undertake the process in one simple project and not have to keep coming back and asking for further equipment. We tool up to go there and hit it in one hit.
And typically, when you go there, you're looking, I mean, I know that you said that in some instances you can drill for 24 hours and others you can't, but typically you're looking at these projects just taking a couple of days.
Yeah, we'll do a borehole in a day. Obviously, if it's a large project, then that we may be there for several months. But people usually want us to be in and out as quickly as we can. You're often under a time frame because other parts of a construction project are on the go. We've done new builds where we've come into the site in one direction, and then by the time you finish the boreholes off, you can't get out because someone's built a house in the way. But you've got to have your exit strategy. So in projects where you've got house builders in there, the situation can change fairly rapidly.
Yeah, that's interesting that you touch on new builds. I know that there's well, certainly in the interviews that we've done recently, there's been a lot of discussion about just how it would really make a life a lot easier for homeowners, 5 to 10 years time, not having to deal with retrofits for heat pumps and being able to get, whether it's the ground source or air heat pump into their properties now when these properties are being built. Is that something that you're seeing any kind of increase in demand from new builds and property developers now?
Demand has been fairly constant. I think the recent boiler replacement scheme, where you're getting to get £6,000 for a ground source system, is nowhere near enough to cover the cost and make it attractive. So that's an issue that I see in the future. An air source pump is £5,000. Ground source pump is £6,000. Well, the loop that collects the heat from the ground is going to cost way more than £1,000. So I think if they want this technology to take off in the way that they're stating in their white paper, then there needs to be some further investigation into a contribution to the ground loop system. Quite happy as a driller for the £6,000 for a ground source system, but that won't cover the collection network, whether it be vertical boreholes or even horizontal boreholes. And
with regards to, is there any impact on budget or costs for example, if you've got a property developer who thinks, okay, let's put the boreholes in now for water and ground source, as opposed to not doing that, and then you having to try and access those sites in 5 or 10 years time and deal with those homeowners who are kind of almost retrofitting and saying, right, can you come in now and navigate through all these residential areas? Is there any cost implications with regards to that? Would it be a little bit more cost efficient to get a property developer to just address that issue right off the bat before they start to continue to build all these properties?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I think that depends very much on the attitude of the property developer. If you're in a first-time buyer situation, when I speak to people who build houses, they're really interested in selling the house for the lowest possible price, because when you buy your first house, usually you max yourself out to the limit in terms of getting a mortgage. We've noticed on new builds, which tend to be small developments of probably 5 to 10 houses, out of the way places, very often you can't get gas there, you can't get water there. And we've done combined water and heating systems, and these houses have been sold with an environmental benefit to them because they're green houses. But that tends to be not the first time buyer. These houses tend to be fairly expensive, very exclusive, and they are the people who will tend to be prepared to pay a little more for having a sustainable heating system. So yeah, we've found that's the case, and we've had situations where There's been part of the development has been a pump house there which deals with the heating system and their water system. So they're off grid, but they're on grid as a collective number of 5 to 10 houses. They pay a fee every year into some pot which covers maintenance and repair costs. So they are off grid, but they have all the on grid advantages.
And just to go back, I mean, you mentioned their maintenance costs, but with regards to maintenance costs for the actual boreholes, you said that once you put the borehole in, you're really looking at minimal or nominal, no maintenance costs going forward. So that is a massive benefit to the homeowner.
Well, that's the crux of the argument I'm going to put forward, because someone's going to say drilling the borehole is expensive, and if it's cost £5,000, £6,000, £7,000, I don't disagree. That's a fair investment. But there's not many things you invest in which will last you 100 years without any maintenance. So if you look at that cost and divide it by its useful life, the cost of borehole is dirt cheap, because they're made of, the loops are made of polyethylene. They don't corrode, they don't rust, they don't get attacked by microorganisms. So once it's in place, and as long as it's been put in place properly and works properly, it will last literally a lifetime. Now, I don't think of anything else where you buy it, put it in there and almost forget about it for effectively a lifetime, probably a lifetime and a half.
And the UK has probably got the added benefit that there's no real seismic activity, so you're not even going to get those earth movements that are going to potentially crack or damage these boreholes.
Yeah, and then you're protected against extreme weather as well.
We're not living in Iceland where seismic activity is a serious issue. So once it's in place, that's it. You forget about it. And as I say, mine are buried, and I don't need to go back to them. The ground collection network, it's a 100-year investment. And what we're really saying is, if you want your ground source system putting in, you've got to pay that up front and almost just take it on the chin. When we went from town gas to North Sea gas, you didn't expect the homeowner to pay for the connection of the gas pipes and the conversion. You pay that over the drip. We may still be paying it because they were converted in the 60s. So I think it's very unfair. It does slant away from the advantage of ground source, the fact that you have to pay for yourself the ground collection network, despite the fact it's still be working in 100 years' time.
So do you feel that there is more of an onus on a governmental level to contribute to that, because that homeowner is almost bearing the cost, as you're implying, for 100 years of all the generations ahead of them to use it? Is there more of a national onus for everybody to kind of contribute to that?
Well, the £5,000 or £6,000, depending on whether it's air source or ground source, cost is a payment to replace the boiler itself. In terms of the collection network that is outside the property, if it's an air source, it's free because it's the air. But you've got to put the network in there to get the energy out of the ground. Now, I don't know whether the government are being clever there by saying, well, we'll subsidise the boilers for the tune of £5,000 or £6,000. And then they may come back later on and say, right, we're now going to pay for the loops to collect the stuff out of the ground, because that is a long-term investment, but it's got a very short-term hit. You've got to get over an obstacle there of many thousands of pounds. And once it's in place, it's there for a long time. And my view is that's the thing that the government should be subsidising. They should be subsidising the thing that gets the heat out of the ground. And they've got a mechanism for doing that. It would fit in, dovetail quite nicely with their idea of subsidising the boilers with their £5,000 or £6,000 payment, and then looking at the ground source and actually making a significant contribution into the thing that collects the energy out of the ground for 100 years.
Just talking about the rest of the world with regards to ground source, what other countries are really reliant on ground source for heating and actually water boreholes? Are there other countries, maybe in Europe? I mean, I know that, for example, Sweden is a country that we look at regularly for heat pumps and air source, but is it something that they're also ahead on with regards to ground source and boreholes?
They're way ahead of us because they aren't sitting on an island of coal. We've managed for many hundreds of years to fund and generate enough energy out of the black stuff in the ground to support our expansion. If you're in Sweden, you haven't had that advantage. They've had to look and think outside the box. And it's no accident that the Swedes are way ahead of us. But if you look at what's happening elsewhere, in Germany, in France, Scandinavia, the Czech Republic, they're way ahead of us. And we're We're lazy in a way because we've been sitting on an island of coal. Well, we still have plenty of coal left, but it's no longer deemed to be acceptable to use that as a source of energy. So we have to think about something else. And it's much more expensive to use a ground source or an air source system than the advantage of coal. If coal had been more expensive, then we wouldn't have been in this situation. But as a country, we've had an advantage of sitting under massive deposits of coal, and that's the way we've engineered our industrial revolution. The Swedes have that advantage. They've got to do it a different way. But they've taught us how to do it, and we should really be following what they're doing. And Sternberg, of course, sits on the moral high ground there. Her country does it right, and we do it wrong. We've been doing it wrong for a long time.
Are you excited about the next 5 to 10 years in boreholes and ground source? And that do you think that it will become a lot more common with regards to homeowners, kind of almost top of mind thinking when they move into a property or when they're buying a property, do I have a water borehole? Can I get ground source in here? Do you think that there's going to be a shift in the way that people think about their resources in homes?
And we do a lot of exhibitions. We just do grand designs. And quite a few people came onto our stand and said they wanted to be off-grid. They wanted to be self-sufficient. They got this good life concept. And if you've got a borehole there for your water, and you've got a boreholes there for your ground source, and you've got solar panels, solar PV, whatever, you're starting to get away from all the issues where you're dependent on state control. There are people who want that situation, and it will come in time that a certain number of people will always want to be off-grid, if you like. Other people are going to stay on grid because it's cheaper. And I don't think with the current level of subsidies that are being offered, there's enough incentive there to get people to shift over. You've got to have some sort of incentive there, and that incentive has to be thought through very carefully. If we're serious about getting carbon neutral by 2050, then someone's got to get in there, and it's going to cost money. If it wasn't going to cost money, we'd have done it that way to start with. We've gone down the coal route because that was cheaper. We've now got to learn from the Swedes to say, right, we don't use coal, we've got to use something else. We're sitting on an enormous thermal reserve under the earth. We've got to get that out and put that to work in an environmentally friendly way. The £6,000 is a total farce. It's a joke.
Yeah, it does seem that there is a real disconnect there, where even when we were talking to Laura Bishop, and she mentioned that it was just £1,000 extra for a homeowner who's thinking about, if they're looking at a heat pump for their air source, it's £5,000 grant from next year, and for ground source, it's going to be an extra £1,000 on top of that £5,000 to bump them up to £6,000, and that just doesn't seem in any way a rational thought process when you look at the actual cost implications. If you're looking at giving a grant for two different things, you should be looking at the cost differences between those two different things and giving something that's more equitable. I think that the percentage increase of just £1,000 from 5,000 is just not going to make a lot of sense to a lot of homeowners.
The RHI scheme was far more it compensated ground source a lot more than it did air source. Yes, you had to put the funds up front. But you did get a lot more in the form of payments over the course of the next 7 years. The fact that they're not giving you the money up front, with the new grants that are going to potentially come in April, it just doesn't compare.
Well, it was potentially it was capped at about £30,000 a year. Now, if you think about it from my point of view, I've got to buy my drilling rig. That's not a cheap thing to buy. It costs many hundreds of thousands of pounds. Runs on diesel. That's not cheap. We bring it there on a low loader. That's not cheap. And then we spend a day or 2 or 3 drilling a borehole. And I've got to have 2 guys there, highly skilled, who want to be paid as well. What do I get extra on top of the air source system? I get £1,000. It's a joke. It is never going to work like that. In fact, that £6,000 has killed the domestic ground source market at a stroke.
I was just going to say that because I would imagine that commercial players would probably, be able to absorb those costs because they'll be able to pass it on. But as a domestic user, there's just no ways. We would have considered that, but now there's just no way. Which
is why we have to subsidise the collection network, because an air source pump and a ground source pump, they're not that dissimilar in terms of the cost of them. Ground source can be more expensive. That's where the £1,000 comes in. But the air source just pulls its energy out of the air. We've got to get it out of the ground, which means we've got to get into the ground. And that is not a cheap thing to do. So if we're serious about putting 600,000 units in, 10% of those are going to be ground source. We've got to find a way of making that attractive. There is a way for the government to do it because they can simply pay for the loop and make their contribution. But at the moment, I think it's a suck it and see. They've said, right, see how they get on with that. And I think our industry have gone, forget it. We're not interested. Fortunately, we do other things. We do water boreholes, we do gas boreholes from landfill sites. We're concentrating on that because at the moment, if the ground source system doesn't get some more subsidy, then it'll only be big projects which are going down the ground source route. The domestic market will just disappear.
You just mentioned also about having a couple of highly skilled drillers on site to carry out these projects. I'm just interested that with regards to air source, with part of that discussion at the moment is that the huge concerns of, it's all very well the government saying that they want to meet a minimum of 600,000 to potentially 1 million installs a year, but the actual installers are just not there. We don't have that many installers in the UK to meet that demand. What is the staffing issues? Are you facing any staffing concerns moving forward with regards to drilling, because they are such highly skilled and almost, very kind of unique? I mean, you don't come across a driller every day of your life. So, a driller is somebody who's really...
It's a skill set that's really honed in on doing one thing.
Yeah.
It takes 5 years to train a driller. It's a bit like being a doctor. And you can't just pick these guys off the shelf. I mean, we've got situations where, all right, there's a shortage now of HGV drivers. So what do? We go and raid the bus companies and steal their drivers because, to all intents and purposes, they're driving a large diesel-propelled vehicle. It's not that dissimilar. Training drillers up is going to be part of the skill set we're going to need to develop. And I sit on the British Drilling Association's technical committee. We're working hard on training guys up, getting apprentices in. At the moment, a lot of drilling organisations are fully occupied on HS2. That won't last forever. So as HS2 comes down, that will release into the marketplace drillers and equipment. So I'm confident the drillers are going to be there, but for the drillers to be there, there has to be the incentive to want to work. And at £1,000 extra for a system, it ain't going to happen.
So thank you very much for joining us today, Geoff. It was a pleasure having you on, and I certainly know a lot more about boreholes and ground source than I did. And
certainly did. I mean,
this morning.
I've always had a lot of questions about it, so thank you so much for actually answering them. Actually, I do feel like I know a lot more about drilling now.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.